All right, so in this video, we're going to start looking at Chapter 35. Chapter 35 is about the interwar period outside of Europe. And so in this first video, we're going to look at Asia. So 3 places in Asia: India, China, and Japan. In the next video, we'll look at Africa and Latin America during the interwar period. So first up, let's talk about India. So as we have mentioned before, India is a British colony. And because India is so big, it was impossible for the United Kingdom to govern it directly. So what they did is they trained Indians to govern in the British way. And this is pretty common amongst all the British colonies. Now, while this did cut down on the number of British people that had to go to India, because if you just train Indians to do it, you don't need to send a lot of British people, training Indians to do it is efficient and it's relatively inexpensive, but it does expose Indians to European ideas like democracy and nationalism. So while this is a good idea, it does start to put ideas into the heads of Indians. And so there starts to be a movement for Indian independence. The move for Indian independence is centered around this organization called the Indian National Congress. And I'm going to abbreviate that, the INC. Now, at first, the INC was an organization that tried to facilitate British rule in India. So they kind of acted as a liaison between the British and the Indians. But after World War I, the INC became more interested in what's called self rule. So this is kind of like what Canada has. So they would have more say over their domestic policies like taxes and infrastructure. But the British didn't want this, and the British responded with repression. Probably due to racism. The Canadians were allowed to do this, but the Indians weren't. So enter into this the father of Indian independence. His name is Mohandas Gandhi. So Gandhi was a very well suited character for what we're about to talk about. He was trained in London as a lawyer. The British would often find intelligent Indians or intelligent people in their colonies and send them back to Great Britain to study. And Gandhi was one of these people that was deemed to be intelligent enough to be educated in Great Britain. And so he was trained as a lawyer. And then he worked as a lawyer in South Africa. And in South Africa, he becomes aware of the racism towards other Indians in South Africa. Now, this is a little bit controversial because it's unclear if Gandhi was racist towards the Africans in South Africa or if he was just aware of racism in general towards Indians and Africans. But regardless of how he viewed the racism, he becomes aware of the racism towards Indians in South Africa and then returns to India after 25 years in South Africa ready to push for independence. And so to do this, he adopts Indian ideas to help the independence movement. Specifically, the old Jainist idea of ahimsa, or nonviolence. And so Gandhi becomes one of the first practitioners of nonviolent resistance to oppression. And this idea would get picked up by other leaders fighting against oppression, namely Martin Luther King. But Gandhi picks up on this old idea and he starts using nonviolent resistance towards the British. And so, starting around 1915, this is about when he returns to India. And he turns the INC into an organization that pushes for independence. So the INC turns into this egalitarian organization opposed to British rule. So he starts pushing for things that will help all of the Indians unite against the British. So he wants to unite all Indians against the British. And so principally, he opposes the caste system. The caste system separates the Indians, and we need to unite them. So the INC opposes the caste system. They were also against industrialization because that helped the British. They led boycotts of British goods. And again, all of this stuff is nonviolent, but the British reaction to this was violent. One of the most important incidents that happened here is something called the Salt March. So the British forbid Indians from producing their own salt. They had to buy it from the British. So Gandhi announces he will march to the ocean and make salt. And it becomes this big spectacle. Everybody's watching Gandhi walk to the ocean. And when he gets to the ocean, he walks for several days. He's not close to the ocean. And when he gets there, he makes salt and he's arrested. But the point of this was to highlight British oppression and get people on his side. So, as we get into the 1930s, the British do eventually cave in. So specifically, this happens in 1937 with something called the India Act. Now, the problem with the India Act was that it highlighted the economic differences between the Muslims and the Hindus. The Hindus were better off economically, and the Muslims were generally poorer. And so giving the Indians a little bit of autonomy meant that the Hindus had more of a political voice because they had more money. And so instead of actually helping the Indians become independent, this actually divided the Indians even more. Except now, instead of this being about caste, it's now about religious difference. And so now we start to see a push for Muslims to separate from the Hindus. So the leader of the Muslims, his name was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Wanted two countries for India. He wanted a Hindu country and a Muslim country that he wanted to call Pakistan. And so we'll deal with that, but we'll deal with it after World War II. So next up is China. So as we've been hinting at, the Qing dynasty collapses in 1911, and a group of Chinese nationalists take power. So they say it's a republic, and the guy in charge, his name is Sun Yat-sen. But it's actually just run by local military leaders. There really is no central government. And this lack of government is pretty bad for the Chinese people. No one is building or maintaining roads or irrigation. The opium trade is growing. That's not good. The unequal treaties are still around. So China really has no control over their own economy. So after World War One, the Chinese hoped that all this talk of self determination would free them, that this was the start of a new beginning for China. But actually, the Paris Peace Conference just gave Japan more control over China. So at this point, after the Paris Peace Conference, the Chinese had had enough of listening to foreigners, whether they're Europeans or Japanese. They just want all of the foreign influence out. So on May the 4th, 1919, we kind of get a second Boxer Rebellion. So this is a Chinese anti-foreigner uprising. And a lot of people, a lot of Chinese people, became interested in Marxism as a result of this, because Marxism and the Soviets were against imperialism. So this is kind of the beginnings of a strong communist influence in China. Now, the actual government of China, the nationalist government of China, opposed communism but they worked with the communists to kick all the foreigners out of China. So for a few years, from 1919 to 1927, they actually worked together. The nationalists and the communists worked together to kick the foreigners out of China. But in 1927, the leader of the nationalists, his name was Chiang Kai-shek, unexpectedly attacked the communists led by Mao Zedong and forced them to run away. So Mao, who's going to be important later on, led the communists on the Long March. And that's exactly what it was. It was a very long march. It was about 6,000 miles to safety in the mountains. And from that point on, the communists basically are in hiding pretty much until World War II gets started. So they are in hiding from 1934 to 1936. One last thing we'll say about China, and we'll talk about Japan in our next video, is that despite all of these problems, and China had lots of problems, the Great Depression wasn't one of them. And that's mostly because China's economy was so small at this point and cut off from the rest of the world the Depression didn't affect them. So like the Soviet Union, China only had room to grow after World War II. But we'll worry about that when we get into World War II. For right now, we're going to hit Japan in our next video. So we'll talk about Japan after World War I in the next video, in addition to Africa and Latin America. So in our next video, we'll wrap up this chapter on the interwar period outside of India. And this is Mr. Nissen signing off.